for our last session in this particular series this afternoon, we're going to be hearing from Herewini Easton and Brittany Hoback, who are from Victoria University of Wellington, and they both work at VUW as learning advisors. I hope I got that acronym right, sorry. I think it's Victoria University of Wellington, isn't it? So it might be incorrect there. So the title today is Guiding Students Through Ethics and Te Tiriti or Waitangi Obligations, and how does your research conform to your university's Treaty of Waitangi policy? So I think just even in the title alone, there's a lot to unpack there. So I'm really looking forward to this session, and without further ado, I'll hand the rākau over to you, Herewini and Brittany. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Tēnā tātou ngā mihi rā kia tātou. No mai hara mai ki tēnei kōrero.
Kia ora, hello loa gata, me mlami ame Brittany, mo me blo Wellington now. Thank you. We're just getting the screen sharing set up, but today we are talking about kind of a workshop that Herewini and I have put together to guide students through their ethics application, and especially the Te Tiriti o Waitangi obligations. So our presentation today, the purpose is to show a little bit about the workshop that we present to the students and a little bit of the rationale behind. We'll go over the background of the workshop, of why we started this workshop, who we target, and what we did and how we did this. And with that, we'll go into a description of some of the main research components, a description of the Herenga Waka Victoria University values and the Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles, and then what we've done to guide students through this process. So the reason that we started this workshop was that as part of the ethics application for a lot of the postgrads for research, students have to address a question that says, describe how your research will uphold our Te Tiriti o Waitangi statute in practice. The university has a published statute, but often we find that students may or may not know how to answer this, or may be from other areas where they might not understand what Te Tiriti o Waitangi has to do with their research.
And this is relevant when we work with our international postgraduate students who are here for their masters or PhDs. So how do they approach answering that question? So we've come up with some ideas, and why is it relevant? As Brittany mentioned, we do have a university Te Tiriti o Waitangi statute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. And the statute says basically that the Te Tiriti o Waitangi is relevant for all research for consistency around New Zealand research projects.
So what we did, yes, looked at the policies, looked at our values, our principles, and did a little bit of weaving to bring it all together. And we will show you examples of that later on in the presentation.
So when we start our workshops, we often have students think about what research components they might think about around ethics and where they might find ethical issues. So often students are familiar with the idea of ethical consent, sometimes around how they need to have fair treatment of their participants, or kind of the ways that they select the participants. So we start by kind of conversing around what are ethical issues in each of these different areas. What are different areas of your research that you might think about might be something that you need to consider when you're thinking about ethics of your research. And these are some of the research components that often we talk about. So the research design, how data is collected, participant selection, participant treatment or involvement, and that includes things like koha and how participants are treated for their time, data management, power dynamics, consent, reciprocal exchange, outcomes of the research, and then distribution of the research. And these kind of set up for us to integrate with the values and the Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles.
So these are the values that Te Herenga Waka uses. It used to be called Māori values, but I sort of put my hand up to that one and went, no, it's university values. And when you look at the values, it's very humanistic. The Akoranga is the space and the place where the students work with their communities or their participants, whether it's in the community itself or here at the university. Kaitiaki, I remind students it's a very thin line between caretaker and guardians. Rangatiratanga, who is the rangatira in your research? It is the researcher, but it also is the community. And these are the descriptions that the university has given. So we look at those descriptions, we break them up, share them with the students. So everything we are doing is a reflection of our university policies.
So once the students have the understanding of what these values mean, and often they have been exposed to them in other parts of their research, but thinking about diving a little bit deeper into what each of these mean, we then give them this kind of chart or this resource that Herewini has developed where they can fill in what they think that might be applied to in terms of what their research possibilities are. So this is just an example of how students might use this blank space to think about in terms of Akoranga, of a place of learning and teaching, how might that be applicable in their study? Or in terms of whanaungatanga and showing community or involvement in community, how might that be applicable in terms of the ethics that they bring to their research project? So this gives them the time to engage with these values and how it is applied to their research before we lead them or support them in thinking about different ways that that might be.
So with the Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles, we guide them back to our statute. We work through the statute with them and use the same sort of format as the values. So there are the principles, there's the description from the university, and think about some possibilities in their research.
So then once they've had a chance to do that on their own and think about research for their own, we then give them this guide where we've gotten a couple of suggestions of how they might think about these different parts of the Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles and the university values and how they might be integrated into their research. So things like for kaitiakitanga, thinking about if you are the researcher, how are you being a kaitiaki of the research, but also how are you being a kaitiaki of the data, and how are you being a kaitiaki of the participants in anonymity, and how are you being a protector of the sensitive data. Thinking about the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, thinking about who has governance or accountability over the research. And this also allows them to think about from the ethics standpoint, but also the research design standpoint of how are they going to involve maybe their communities or the research participants in the actual design of the research to be leaders in that research. So this kind of relates to how we have envisioned this in terms of weaving the values to the ethics of the research project. And there's a beautiful picture that's not showing up right now of someone weaving thatch, but I'll hand it over to you.
So with the weaving, we have the aho and the whenu. So we've called the aho tapu, which is the sacred thread, the research question. We prompt the students to really think hard about their question. There are words in the question that could actually become chapters in their thesis. So we really challenge them, what do you mean by that? So when we're weaving our He Whāriki Rangahau, We incorporate the values as the aho and the ethical research project, their thesis, through the whenua.
So thinking about that idea of weaving together both of the values and the principles that they've found, and then the different research components where they might find ethical issues or where they might think about ethical issues in terms of relating to those principles or to those values, we set up this chart, but we also have them think about it as a weaving activity in terms of weaving a research mat. So we have both, we have two charts like this, one with the values and then the other with the key principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and thinking about those different parts of a research project.
Now, most weavers would set down the aho first and then incorporate the whenua. But our picture here, we've got the whenua first, which are the components of the thesis. And now we include the aho. So as you can see, the values touch every whenua, and it's embedded throughout their thesis. It's the same with the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
Yeah, so we really get them to think about kind of where does each of these principles, when they think about those different research possibilities, where does it fall within these different parts of thinking about a research design and thinking about the ethics application of how they're explaining their research in order to weave this kind of research map.
Now, you notice that the whenua and the aho could be quite loose. That's all good. It's only draft. It's not until you get to the editing part of the thesis that's when you start to tighten the weaving up.
And
these are some examples. It doesn't have to be a whāriki. It could be a kono. It could be or a table mat. The whole idea is that the whāriki is the carpet for the thesis, or it's embedded into the thesis.
so the idea is that every ethics application, every design for their research is going to be different, but that all of them have some of these key components in them. And so by thinking about and weaving those key components with the key values and the Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles, it gives them a framework of which ones they want to pull out and highlight and tighten up in order to put those things into their ethics application to show exactly how they're adhering to the statute, whether they're doing research on Aotearoa New Zealand whenua or not, and whether they are from New Zealand or not, thinking about that these all have relevance for these principles. Okay. So that's just a brief overview of the workshop series that we've been doing with the different resources that we have developed for the students to think about the idea of weaving through Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles within each part of their research in terms of the research components, and then how they can answer that on the ethics application when they're applying for research ethics application. But now we'd love to hear your feedback, your questions, your comments, or how you might use this in terms of your school values and Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles.
Now, mihi Herewini and Brittany, that was really I just, gosh, I'm already jumping into, because, well, Massey, Te Tiriti-led university kind of says it all. But what I was wondering about when you're talking about the beautiful mahi you're doing there is, how do you make that information available? I mean, like, is it uni-wide, college-wide? Is it one-to-ones? Is it workshops? How are we getting it out there?
Yeah, currently we're doing it as workshops offered by Student Learning. So it's marketed for postgraduate students and for thesis, actually for all postgraduate students, master's levels, even coursework upwards. So it's in-house in Student Learning, We have been contacted by our ethics committee to see if we could put some of these resources into the ethics application that students could then link to, so that they might have a little bit more awareness of how they could be doing this. And then it also comes up in our one-to-one appointments, definitely, if we have students working on that part, or even masters by coursework students sometimes still have to think about those kinds of how they would incorporate Te Tiriti o Waitangi into their research.
I'm smiling because we've been shoulder tapped by our faculty of graduate research to come and do a workshop with them.
Nice, that is excellent. Does anyone have any questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself, type in chat, because I've got another burning question, but I don't want to hog the floor. Basically, I was wondering, where does research supervisors fit in all of this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that is something that we've found, is that and one of the reasons that was another kind of instigator for this workshop was that we had some supervisors advising students, oh, you don't have to really pay attention to that part of the ethics application, which was really frustrating. And so in order to show kind of why this is so relevant and how this might be things that they're thinking about already, but they just haven't tied it to the principles, this is something that we have put together for students to kind of get a little bit more understanding. And it is really interesting because sometimes we'll have students from Aotearoa, New Zealand, who are well familiar with Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles, and sometimes we'll have brand new postgraduates, international students who have landed a couple of weeks ago and just are going to every workshop that we offer. So it's a really interesting mix too. But with working with faculty of graduate research, that might be a way of possibly putting it into workshops for supervisors as well, which could be something we could look into.
Yeah. And yes, Catherine put a note in chat there. Yes, it is possible. And yes, it'll happen.
Yes, we can share the resources as well.
And how's this received by different groups of students? Rachel, thank you. Very positively, because they too have some weaving in their culture, so they understand the process.
Yeah, and I think it really helps students think that it's not, thinking about Te Tiriti o Waitangi is not such a foreign idea, because they see how it aligns in terms of governorship or protection over data. They see how it aligns with things that they may have already started talking about with their supervisors, and then just it's kind of giving them the vocabulary of how that fits with Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles, which is, yeah, so it's well received.
Yeah, it's such important mahi. At Massey, we have a very similar question in the ethics application. And it's quite interesting because the advisors that work in that space say that the ones that answer that question, you can really tell they've thought about it, because the answers they provide are, they consider a lot of different things other than just answering, yes, I've spoken to a Māori advisor. Yeah. Yeah.
What is really great, when they bring their thesis in and we going through it with them, you actually see those kupu coming out in their writing. So it's not just a ticker box. They actually believe in those values and the principles, and it's in their writing. It's throughout their chapters. It's wonderful.
It's really fun too to think about with students that may have not even started on the research but are quite at the beginning, of kind of the aha that they could even start thinking about it as a research design level of how could I not hold all of the leadership with me myself, but how can I make rangatira of my community members as well, or thinking about kind of the whole research design process, not just the tick box of the ethics or working with communities. Yeah.
Well said, and thank you.